Once you have your natural composition set up, you're ready to start adding color. Now, the way that this is arranged, it's a little hard sometimes to determine what is the positive space of where an object actually is to what is negative space where it's the background. There's no object there. So the way I'm going to handle that is to create contrast with a color scheme. So I'm going to select a color scheme for my positive space, and then I'm going to select a contrasting color scheme for my negative space, so that in the end my objects all end up, popping from that negative space, and I can clearly see them. Now, the other thing that we're going to be paying attention to is color mixing. So for this particular project, we're going to, as much as possible, work with a limited palette, which will then force us to mix colors. So when you start with just the primary colors, for example, red, yellow, and blue, and I actually selected more of a magenta color over red because it's just going to do nicer mixing for me if I do that. If I stick with this limited color palette, I don't have to use these colors as they are. I can mix them together to create all kinds of new colors. I can create the secondary colors by mixing these, and I can create the tertiary colors as well. It'll be a little bit harder to create the neutrals, except for gray, with this limited color palette with markers, but the other materials that I'm going to show will be available. Now, I have split my composition into 4 parts to show 4 different materials to use to do this. For all 4, I'm going to still stick with that limited palette. So the things I've got available to me to use that I'm going to use in the different sections, I have tube watercolors here. So these are just very concentrated watercolors that come in a liquid form. You still do add water to them. You don't use them like acrylic paint or tempera paint, just straight out of the tube. They're meant to add water too, but they give a really great range of colors. And I have selected the magenta, cyan, and yellow, as well as white, and then I have a cake of black to work with. So I can actually, from these 5 colors, make any color out there. All right, so that's one of my options. Another option is magenta, cyan, and yellow watercolor cakes, and along with that, then a black cake. Now you'll notice I don't have a white cake. I could use this tube watercolor, but if I don't have this available, this isn't a super common thing to just like have around your house. If I don't have that available, what I can do is allow the white of the paper to create my lighter shade, or lighter tints, I should say, my lighter tints by using more water and less pigment with this paint. So if I, work a lot of water into it and use less of the actual pigment paint, when I paint that onto my paper, the white of the paper will show through more, allowing me to have those lighter tints. And if I use more of the pigment, I'm going to get a more saturated color, and that'll, give that variety. And then I've got the black to use to make it darker. So I'm going to use the same cake for both of these. The other thing that I have is using markers as watercolors. So when I do that, I'm actually going to use a separate little thing to put my markers in, not like physically, but I'm going to actually take these markers and I'm going to, this is just styrofoam, it needs to be something like that that's not water soluble, something that these colors can sit on top of. And I'm going to create a palette of pigment by just coloring marker onto that, and then I can use that to dip in just like I would regular paint. It can dry, and then I can just re-wet it to use again and again and again. You will be able to do this better if your markers are on the newer side. If they're starting to kind of dry out, you'll find that it's not super easy to get enough pigment placed onto your surface. Like this black one's kind of dried out. I'm going to need to find a new black one to work with. Now, if you're doing this, one thing you will find, I'll note, is for black markers, there's a lot of other pigments in there, and you may find that like blues and greens are coming out of your black. Just be aware that that may happen. And then I've got another little piece here that I can do mixing in. So like I can get a little bit of the red, a little bit of the blue, and I can come over here and mix within this tray. And then the last thing I have is a limited range of just regular colored pencils. And I would use these just like you would use colored pencils, except for I would make sure I was layering them on top of each other so that I can achieve the different colors that I want to achieve. For example, if I want orange, I would use these two color pencils. I wouldn't color super hard with them. I would color first, you know, with the yellow, and then add a layer of the more magenta, which again, I selected magenta over red just because it's going to do nicer color mixing. So I would do a layer of the yellow, a layer of the magenta, and then depending on what I think of that, I can come back and add a second layer of that yellow on there until I get the color that I want and the saturation, meaning like the vibrancy of the color that I want. So I'm going to treat all 4 of my sections with a different method so that you can see all of them in turn, but I'm going to stick with the same color scheme for each one. And the color scheme that I'm going to select, I'm going to go with monochromatic blue for my negative space. So everything that's not an object is going to be monochromatic blue. So tints, tones, and shades of just blue. Now for my positive space, I want that to stand out. So I need to think of a way to do that. If I just used like other tints, tones, and shades of blue, then of course they're not going to stand out. I need to work with something that's going to stand out. So I think for my positive space, I'm going to go with an analogous scheme of orange to yellow. Okay, so I'll use my yellows and my oranges in all of my positive space so that those objects pop out from that blue. Now the other thing to note is everywhere where there's a shape is going to be treated with its own color. So this section of this leaf right here is going to be one version of either my orange or my yellow or the mix of the two. This section, even though it's part of the same leaf, I'm going to use a different variety of that color in it because it's a combo of part of the leaf and part of this larger acorn. Okay, so as you're working, try to push yourself so that each section, each shape, each enclosed area is different from the one next to it, and it's different from the one next to it. It's different, you know, this is a new color, 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 so that there's a lot of color variety within your work.